So my name is Catherine Kennedy, and for my digital presentation, I chose to do the Columbine High School shooting. So offender background, we'll go through Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold's background separately, just because there was two offenders for this crime, and they have different upbringing. So I'll go through them one by one. So to start with Eric Harris, he was born on April 9th, 1981, and he grew up within an American military family. His father was a United States Air Force pilot, which naturally led him to having quite a strict parenting style. Due to Eric's father's occupation, the family had to move quite frequently throughout his childhood and into his teenage years. Eric was born in Kansas and moved to Michigan in early childhood to a small town called Ascota. He lived in a house with his family within the small town in Michigan until the family moved about 10 minutes down the road to live on the military base in a house. The family then moved to Plattsburgh in upstate New York. And finally, after a few years, they moved to Colorado after Eric's father retired. So as a child, Eric was able to build interpersonal relationships with other children, although he lost many friends due to his frequent moving. In writings I found from Eric's childhood, he states that he felt alone, lost, and even agitated, that he was losing friends over something that he could not control. He also states in one of his papers from childhood, it doesn't take long to make a best friend, but it only takes two words to lose one, and those words are "we're moving." Once Eric Harris got to high school, he had a much harder time making friends and fitting in, although he became good friends with a fellow Columbine High School outcast by the name of Dylan Klebold. Eric Harris possessed education up until his senior year of high school. So when focusing on the background of Eric Harris, I think it's important to focus primarily on his aggression and violence. Harris possessed and showed signs and symptoms of childhood and teenage aggression, violence, sadistic behaviors, and racist behavior. In terms of aggression and violence, Harris always had an unhealthy preoccupation with guns, violence, and killing. Some of his other childhood schoolwork, which can be found online, shows Harris specifically talking about how him and his siblings would play for hours on end with toy guns, pretending to wound one another and shoot others. Harris continued to show aggression and talking about his classmates who bullied him. His online posts, which can also be found online prior to him committing his mass murder, show extreme aggression towards those who bullied him within his high school. In terms of sadistic behavior, he had quite an obsession with Nazi Germany and with Hitler's final plan. So in some of his other writing, he said that he wants to execute this final plan where only about 5 people who he does like get to live. He would also perform the Hitler salute on various occasions, and he had narcissistic behavior in a sense that he saw himself as godlike, and he thought that he would be the one to choose who could live and who wasn't able to live. He especially had hatred towards some of the minorities and towards Christians and other religious beliefs. So Eric Harris was arrested alongside Dylan Klebold in 1998 for breaking into vehicles, stealing computers and computer parts. The boys had their criminal charges expunged after successfully completing a juvenile diversion program, anger management counseling, and regular counseling. So when looking at Dylan Klebold, this is the other offender in the Columbine High School shooting. He was born on September 11th, 1981, and he grew up within an upper middle class family. So did Eric Harris, and his parents were well off and provided well for the family. He was very intelligent as a child. He was enrolled in many different gifted student programs, religious student programs, and other ones. He became friends with Eric Harris in high school when he was kind of an outcast and he didn't really have many other friends since he was very shy. So Eric Harris kind of took him under his wing. He had interests in technology and video games. So he worked at the school for the stage crew behind stage doing sound stuff. And he had another job. He worked at a pizza shop with Eric Harris. He did possess symptoms of depression, and before he was arrested prior to committing the massacre, as I said previously, when they were breaking into vehicles and stealing computer parts and computers. So the nature of the offense, this was a mass multi-site murder. So in terms of the timeline of the murder, the offenders arrived at school in separate cars at 11:10 a.m. on April 20th, 1999. So they made homemade bombs and they put them in the cafeteria and they set for them, this was their plan A. So they wanted them to go off at around 11:17 a.m. And then they ran outside to their cars and sat by their cars. And by the time they checked their watches, it was past 11:17 a.m. So they realized that those bombs did not detonate. So the plan was that these bombs were within the cafeteria, which was over top of the library. So when these bombs detonated, they would have gone through down into, like, the floor would have crumbled through down into the library, and it would have killed hundreds and hundreds of students. That was plan A. And when that did not execute the way that they wanted it to, at 11:19 a.m., they went to plan B with their two guns that they had. Each of them had a gun, and they began shooting students outside of the building. So once they've shot some students outside of the building, they proceeded to go inside the library, where they basically just open fired and shot specific students that they thought weren't deemed to live, depending on sort of like the groups that they were targeting. And by 11:35, they had killed 13 victims, 12 students, one teacher, and they had wounded more than 20 individuals. So their modus operandi was power, revenge, and fame. They wanted revenge for all those people who had wronged them within the school. They wanted fame. They wanted to have the biggest school shooting in history, which they achieved at that time, and they wanted power. So especially Eric Harris, who was power hungry, he saw himself as godlike, and he wanted to prove that. So victimology, as I said, they targeted specific groups. So those were jocks. So these jocks who had bullied them in the past, that was their number one. So the jocks at Columbine High typically wore hats, like a white hat. So they specifically said anybody wearing a white hat, that's who they wanted to go for. Minorities, so they did kill some African American people. They killed religious students, and then anybody who had wronged them. So the crime showed copycat notion, as it was performed on the same day as the Oklahoma bombings, which was April 20th. The offenders were obsessed with this Oklahoma bombing and wanted to recreate that disaster. And due to their obsession with Hitler, they also performed this crime on his birthday. The offenders died on April 20th, 1999. By about noon, they turned their guns on themselves and they shot themselves. So offender typology, the Columbine massacre was a planned crime, and these offenders were highly organized. So there was evidence of them planning their murders up to a year before. So they had homemade basement tapes in which they would talk about what was coming, but these tapes were never seen until after the crime. So that kind of goes to show that if parents were to have seen those tapes, they could have maybe stopped something, but you never really know. They had various online posts, especially Eric, where he would say who he doesn't like, what bugs him, how he wants to kill people, and so on. And he has journal recordings from after the first time he was in jail where he specifically says kill mankind in big bold letters. So this is something that had been planning for a while, and it's also an organized crime because they did have two plans set up. So they had their plan one with their bomb, and then they had plan two, which was just to shoot people. So the motivation was a combination of sadistic beliefs, psychopathy, video games, and bullying. So the two boys developed a hyperfixation with Hitler and Nazis. So that was for sadistic. Psychopathy is speculated that Eric Harris possessed primarily aggressive, sadistic personality with secondary antisocial, narcissistic, and paranoid features. In terms of video games, the offenders spent their spare time playing video games and even pretending it was their school. So they played their favorite game, Doom, all the time. And then that's how they kind of got the idea that they were going to do that at school. And bullying. So they're both victims of bullying at Columbine High School, oftentimes called homophobic slurs from some of the jocks at the school. So according to the Dietz typologies, Harris and Clay will fall under the spree killer typology, assumed based off their unhealthy preoccupation with Oklahoma bombing and Nazi Germany. According to Holmes and Holmes, offenders fall under the disgruntled employee citizen typology. Their primary motive was revenge to those who had wronged them. And then according to Levi and Fox theory, this one states that mass murders are motivated by vengeance, including three subtypes. So individual specific, category specific, and non-specific. So Harris and Claiborne will fall under the category specific typology, targeting specific categories within the school. So those specific groups that I had mentioned earlier with the jocks, minorities, religious people. So all of those. One of the victims was very religious, and they specifically asked her if she believed in God. So that was something that they were asking throughout the time when they were going through their shooting rampage. They would ask people, do you believe in God? And when some of them said yes, they would shoot them for that. Okay, so we got risk factors. So first we have rejections. These are biopsychosocial risk factors. So we have rejection. So researchers have concluded that pain from rejection is just as bad as physical pain. Social rejection negatively impacts an individual's emotion, cognition, and physical health, which can lead to aggression and violence. So the rejection in high school that the boys faced must have put a strength, like a really big amount of pain in them, and then that can obviously lead to this aggression and violence that they had been developing over a long period of time. Um, Violent media research has shown that continued exposure to depictions of graphic violence, such as those in video games, leads to desensitization. So, since these boys were continuously playing video games, it's just desensitized. Like killing people is just, it becomes a lot more desensitized and normal. So then this goes hand in hand with violent fantasies. The offenders modified their favorite game, Doom, by superimposing faces of classmates, teachers, and anyone who had wronged them. For weapons effect, research indicates that a greater presence of weapons increases an individual's aggression and even testosterone levels. So, since these boys had access to these weapons and they were using them prior to the shooting, it could have increased their aggression levels even more. And social isolation has been identified as the most important external factor leading up to crimes such as school shootings. By isolating oneself from others, you lose the social connection where others can tell you when your behavior is becoming inappropriate. So if they had other friends, maybe their other friends could have said to them, hey, like this is getting a little out of control, but it was for the most part just the two of them together. So they didn't have that third party who could kind of be frank with them when needed. So I just kind of wanted to add this in here, the parents' role. So since these were minors, a lot of people are gonna blame the parents. So I found some stuff about the parents online. So Eric Harris's parents were loving, although strict in nature, as his father was military personnel, as I had said. His actions usually did have bad consequences within the household, such as like being grounded, whatever. I didn't find specifically what it was. His parents were aware of his behavior in his childhood and they enrolled him in juvenile offender programs. And his parents also took him to therapy and they were provided with medication for him. Dylan Klebold's parents were kind, nurturing parents throughout his whole life. His parents were often home. His father worked from home, so he never had that like barrier between him and his parents when they're not really present. They were very present. And Dylan showed signs and symptoms, which his parents were very aware of, and they tried to help him with. I also just wanted to touch on this picture of Dylan Klebold's mom. So I'm not sure if you've seen it or not, but this is a TED Talk done by Dylan's mom that's really, really good. So she kind of dives into what it's like being the mother of a school shooter. And she kind of just reminds everyone, because a lot of people do blame the parents. She said, I mean, I lost my child too. So she kind of said that she never really had an idea that this is something he was going to commit. And she had to go through the grieving phase of losing her son, in addition to feeling so bad for what her son had done to 13 other victims and 20 who were wounded. So it's a really good watch. It's just on TED Talk. And then I just want to throw this in too. These are some of the movies that I've watched about the topic that I really enjoyed. Bowling for Columbine, it's a popular one. It's been out for a really long time. Michael Moore explores circumstances leading to Columbine. So how easy it is to access guns, the difference in Canada and why it's not such a problem in Canada, and some more stuff. I think there's even a scene where he like signs up for a bank account and he gets a gun for it. So it's pretty crazy how the the States is sometimes with that kind of thing and how different it can be from Canada. And then I'm Not Ashamed is the story about Rachel Scott, who was a religious girl and she had a diary that she wrote in, or a journal, and they took pieces from her journal and made a documentary kind of movie. Well, not a documentary, but a movie based on her real life experiences from her journal. And here's my references. Thank you.